Valiant Warriors. This is going to be a little bit different than what we usually do. As you might have heard, and you can see from the title, Bob Fujitani just passed on September 6th. And we felt we'd be remiss if we didn't have something to say. He got to start early in the golden age, and it's just a name that I don't think enough people recognize as having a lot to do with some of the things that we enjoy now. Particularly where it comes to solar, that's one of the bigger ones that he's known for. But there's just some other stuff too that we're going to be talking about. But I guess we'll just start there and really just see why he's important to this through Valiant. As a lot of you guys know, a lot of the characters at Valiant started with other publishers, like Old Key, Dell, that sort of thing. Magnus, Turok, Solar, Man of the Atom, and so that's kind of where Bob Fujitani comes in on this, because not only was he a solid artist from the early days of comics, just kind of period, he's actually one of the driving forces behind the early issues of Solar. He was one of the most notable things about his work on Solar is he actually came up with the red suit, which is one of the most iconic costumes in comic books. I mean, even if you don't know who Solar Man of the Atom is, when you see the red suit and the visor and stuff, first off, you're like, that's somebody different. Like, that's not a Marvel, that's not DC, that's somebody brand new. And on top of which, it was just very out there for its time. If you've ever read those first couple of issues, Dr. Solar Man of the Atom was not like everything else. The science of it was a little bit more serious. It wasn't hokey. I mean, it was very blunt. Dr. Solar and even Turok that he worked on as well. That's another one that became a Valiant key, and became reiterized in a bunch of different other publishers, Dark Horse, Dynamite, so on and so forth. And now is kind of has its own pastiche in Savage. In case you didn't put that together, but it's a big passing for this guy to be gone now, and just to think about looking back on it, on all the work that he did. I mean, not just with Solar and Turok, he also created the Hangman for Archie Comics, which was super notable because it was a horror book, and it was a superhero horror book. You've had other artists and other creators come up with somewhat similar concepts that still quite didn't do the same blend of superhero and horror like he did with Hangman, but that was kind of the trailblazer for stuff like Doctor Strange and Justice League Dark and Constantine and all these guys that we enjoy now. That he was a part there in the early days planting that seed. He also did a lot of work, just for Archie in general. He did a lot of work for Gleason Comics and titles like Crime Doesn't Pay. He did a Shock Gibson backup in Green Hornet for a number of years for Harvey Comics. And then there was also some lighthearted stuff too that he worked on, like Lassie, Prince Valiant. He had a very long run on the Flash Gordon newspaper strip, which I don't think gets enough credit. We kind of tend to overlook the history of newspaper strips in comics, but they're essential to comics. And just being somebody who was there consistently from the 60s on up into the 90s and further on. I mean, he won an Ink Pot Award in 2005. So that just goes to show the work ethic and commitment he had to the craft. So we just wanted to take a minute to really express our condolences for his family. He's survived by his daughter, Susan Fujitani Meller. And, just take a second to talk about him and some of the work that he did.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, really, because when you look at this, like when we started this podcast really with Valiant Watch, if you go back to our very first episode, we were looking at Solar Man of the Atom #1 from the 1991 Valiant Classic series. And you don't get that really without the contributions made by Bob Fujitani. I mean, this is something that it just shows kind of the shoulders that the stuff that we love is standing on. And I love that you kind of touched on maybe not enough people talking about this. I really haven't seen Fujitani's name come up a lot in the news, especially after passing. And it really is something I think it's important to acknowledge, and also to see kind of what we love now and where it came from. And honestly, when you go back and read some of these books, they are pretty crazy even to read today. The Golden Key comics, Solar Man, the Atom, like 1 through 5 that he really worked on is pretty fascinating. Like you said, it's not hokey at all by any means, and the artwork is definitely a product of its time, but it's something that I think is easy to appreciate now. And while the character, I think, really ties into, what we're doing with Valiant Watch and, why we love what Valiant's doing, it's also a broader discussion of comics and, everything that goes into creating these, wonderful properties that Solar may not be at Valiant right now. I think they're at Dynamite, actually, after going through Dark Horse. They've kind of been bouncing around, and like their time at Valiant is super special. You got the Jim Shooter era of the Solar Man of the Atom #1, and that was one of the books that immediately hooked me into Valiant Classic. It was like, this is crazy. And interesting enough, it was like, we talked about it in the episode, was like how serious it was, and it really wasn't all that hokey when they could have gone like that or in that direction with that character. And then when you go back into this 1960s run, I think it was 65 that it started. I may be wrong on that.
That sounds about right.
Like you go to that and you can honestly see like that approach to the character is fundamental to who Solar Man of the Atom is. And like the use of his powers. I mean, at one point he grabs a flamethrower and just like melts it with his, solar or atomic energy like that. And like, you would expect it, like the artwork looks great, and all the fire burning around, and like the way they did the oozing with him using his powers, but it was never as campy as you would think. And there's like pinup images that they did for a cover and stuff like that is included in it, and it's really awesome artwork to go back and look at. But Fujitani did a ton of work in like comic strips and stuff like that, and stuff that really broadened the scope of comics. They said he retired from commercial comics in like the 80s, but I think he had continued working in strips on up into the 90s. Before
he was doing Flash Gordon. He did that for a long time. I know he did some work on Lassie, which that one kind of stood out to me just because it is so much different from everything else he did. Even when he did, books like Crime Doesn't Pay, that's still like comic territory, like in the 50s and 60s. Even now, like cop noir stuff is still really popular. So to just do something completely out of left field like that, I thought was just really great, to just really show the level of diversity he was capable of doing, And then one thing too that really didn't stand out to me like as younger, but like going back and looking at some of the stuff he did, aside from like Flash Gordon and Judge Wright and Rip Kirby and Skywolf and all these other books, is that he was also one of the first to really do painted work, like for the covers and stuff, as opposed to doing like the traditional pencil, ink, go to a colorist. He would do full color painted covers. That was really amazing, and then going back to what you were saying about Solar, Dr. Solar, there's so much that branched off from just issue #5. Like if you've never read any of the old Solar, I would highly recommend reading #5. Even if like that's not even like your favorite classic Valiant character or whatever, I would still recommend reading it because like you said, seeing him do the different things with his powers, because he was crazy OP. Like but at the same time they found ways to regulate. They didn't stray away from simple concepts that, or even scientifically sound concepts that like, energy can't be destroyed, but it can be displaced. It can be, shifted from one state to another, this, that, and the other. He could do all these crazy things, but he still had to find ways to recharge himself. And then even, going back to what I was saying about like just the costume in itself is just crazy iconic, and that wasn't something that you saw a lot going like in that time frame, you didn't see a lot of like full bodysuit with that wasn't, you know, like wearing your underwear on the outside and a cape and so on. Like this, you just had like straight up nuclear plaque on his chest, this crazy visor, you know, that you can argue till the cows come home, but let's be real, that was Cyclops, bruh. We know where you got that from. But, but you know, it's nuts how like just that one introduction of, okay, well, we started off, you know, making Dr. Soul just kind of like a dude in a trench coat and this, that, and the other, I should say. And then, you know, he's like the glowing green, and that even that was like crazy different from other superheroes at the time. And then you know, they finally put in like an actual superhero costume, and it's just like, you know, it's nuts just how different it was from what was standard at the time. And to think that that one issue, that one change, like, yeah, why don't we just do this? To see like the complete just web, you know, across different publishers and how many different artists and writers have tackled the idea. Even like, you know, the like say like the Acclaim era of Valiant is one that's got like a rocky history to it. It's like not as bad as like the Clone Saga with Marvel or anything, but there's a lot of classic Valiant fans who weren't down with the change, and then there was a lot of ones that jumped in when it started, but then it ended too soon, and so on and so forth. But even in that period, they still were like, we have to keep Solar as an essential character. And you know, they kind of like we talked about this in one of our other videos, where like Doomsday Clock kind of basically copied the premise of Man of the Atom Revelations, because the whole thing with Doomsday Clock was Dr. Manhattan subtly messing with reality and creating this new world. Well, that's literally the premise of that whole miniseries, is that the Acclaim era of Valiant was a direct a direct creation of Dr. Solar's, you know, almost guilty conscience. So it's crazy, like how that even in ways that it's not necessarily readily apparent, how the work that he started with that book just as ripples, you know, shockwaves across time. And, you know, going back to say like classic Valiant, right? I've said this before and I'll say it again. The first 10 issues of really like the first 15, I would say, of the original like classics Solar Man of the Atom from Valiant is pretty much as close as it gets to perfect comic books. From everything from the art choices, the layouts, just the characterizations, how they handled superpowers in a more grounded world, all of it just is nuts, like how well it was done. But the crazy thing about it is that when you go and you read it and you're like, I don't understand why more people didn't know about this. But then you go back and you read, say, like the first 5 issues of Solar, and you're like, they pretty much just took what was already there and they didn't really try to reinvent the wheel. They just added more layers on it of like, you know, just depth and humanization and so on and so forth. And it's nuts. And then, you know, on top of which, like the range, like, you know, that I just touched on a second ago with Bob Fujitani's work. I mean, he did everything from like Lassie and Flash Gordon, but he also did stuff on like Black Condor and Dollman for Quality Comics, who would go on to be, you know, characters for DC, which is funny because that's like the only big publisher that I don't think he ever did any work for directly. So like, even though he didn't directly impact DC, you know, he played a big part in keeping those characters around. And then when they got integrated into DC, you know, they got to be a part of the Freedom Fighters, and we've seen dozens of, you know, reimaginings and in like the 80s with the whole like Earth X thing and the Crosses, the Crosses. I've been in Kentucky that long, I can't be talking like that. The on Infinite Earth stories. I mean, that was like one of the big crossovers in the Arrowverse early on. You know, so it's just like,
that's true.
Just these little seeds all over the place that in some way, shape, or form, you know, his work touched on, that I'm sure if you could ask him, he probably never saw that coming. You know, I mean, who could? But it's just one of those things where like you have to. But one of the things I love about doing Valiant Watch is not just being able to talk about comic books we love, but also being able to like educate people on comic book history. because it's not just about people in costumes beating each other up. It's about the uniqueness of the art that is the comic book format. You know, Alan Moore gets a lot of crap because he doesn't think that it's a good idea to translate comic books into movies and TV shows and so on and so forth, because there's things you can do with the medium that you can't do anywhere else. And to an extent, I agree with that. I still have comic movies and stuff, don't get me wrong. But there still needs to be that, like, acknowledgement and appreciation, not just for what comics put out, but just what comics actually are, you know. And so, like, that's why, like, I wanted to touch on, like, the news strips too, because that's a very big part of comic history that we don't talk about enough. So I don't know, maybe we'll have to tackle that in another video another time. But you know, it's just really cool to be able to look back and see, you know, these things that we enjoy today, and where these influences that we just couldn't, like, you would never call at the top of your head that Doomsday Clock and Another Story are, like, parallel, you know, as far as dealing with, like, man pretending to be God and blah blah blah, and the rally warping and everything else. Like, that's just nuts. You know, I just so happened to find some old Acclaim books, like, right before all this stuff happened, and that's why, like, I know about it. Like, I'm not gonna pretend like I'm, you know, like, oh,
Right.
You never heard of the Denial? It's underground, but, you know, like, it's just cool that to see the history behind the panels unfold like that. Yeah,
and actually, like, when you're going back and reading the 60s series, Solar Man and the Atom, they have pretty cool pages that are historically inspired, or, you know, not exactly at the time, but they had it was over the atomic energy. So, you know, they would kind of, like, give you some, I guess, precedent on what the power source came from and kind of where we were at in our understanding of atomic energy. And I think that was something that was actually really cool, that you don't really see a lot of now, that this character tapped into really well. And even in the character design, like you were talking about with the suit, like, when we first see it, he finally takes off the lab coat, and it's like his partner that's in the other room is like, whoa, you've chosen the right sign. It's like the sign for radioactivity. And it's like bastard on his chest, and it's like, yeah, you kind of did, you know. But the you know, everything about the character just pretty immediately strikes you as iconic. And I think that really helps to give you the waves of influence that you see eventually in Doomsday Clock. And I think that's something that an artist like Bob Fujitani, that's, you know, what brings us here tonight and to talk about him, is that level of impact and that ability and that contribution to the comics industry. So some of the historical aspects, I mean, this is something that, you're just not seeing a lot of people talk about, even though these impacts are felt so, you know, just so massively and everywhere in almost every publisher. And it's something that you can trace back to, like, even when it doesn't work at DC. And it's like, that's the biggest influence that we can spot right now. So,
you know, like, that's nuts. Like, it's just crazy. Like, that works out, that there's just so many of these things that that just piece together so well, and it just makes such an interesting thing, you know, like, to really explore and to sit down and read. And, you know, and another thing I would definitely recommend doing is, if you ever get the chance, you know, pick up some of those little Solar books. If you can read them, I mean, find them, pay for them, but read them digitally if you can, or whatever, you know. But like, it's really cool to be able to go back and really appreciate kind of the forefathers of this movement, you know. I mean, when you look at, like, say, like, the early years of Bob Fujitani, you know, I'm pretty sure, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure he started working in comics as a kind of like an assistant to Will Eisner. He was doing, he was a penciler for some of the work that Will Eisner was doing, and then he did a lot of ghost pencils and a lot of ghost inking, and, you know, a lot of uncredited work, because that's just how it works. You know, he worked with, like, Nick Cardy, who was big because of, like, Aquaman and a lot of other stuff like that.
But like, I actually have a piece of his obituary that that came out online that talks about how he was only 20 when he actually started to work in a New York studio with Will Eisner as a penciler. And it's like, yes, that Eisner of the Eisner Award, you know. And a few years later, he's drawing Hangman and a few other superhero detective comics, a period known as the Golden Age of comics. And he went on to illustrate Prince Valiant, like you said, Lassie, a lot of Flash Gordon strips. And he did a lot of painting too, actually, towards his outside of comics, not just the covers and stuff like that. He did a lot of painting of like landscape work and everything like that. They said he liked the Long Island Sound, the seascapes of it, where he liked to fish. And I think that level of artwork, I mean, starting from they trace his comics work back from when he was a teenager. So from your teenage days into, 97, 98. And like, this is a long time of artwork and just massive influence and reach and exposure. It's pretty incredible to even just dive into. And, what brings us here at Valiant Watch is like this small little segment of his career in Solar Man of the Atom that just like creates this butterfly effect throughout the comics industry. And we can see it now. And, I had no idea when we started this podcast, and I'm like diving into Jim Shooter's Solar Man of the Atom, whose shoulders we're standing on. And Fujitani is, those legends in the industry.
Yeah. And, honestly, I think I kind of put it better myself. It's when you think about the fact that this dude got started, like you said, like in his teenage years, and he's still winning awards for just how beautifully well done his artwork was, and like as late as 2005, like that's something to aspire to. You know what I mean? Like if you want to be in this industry, that's the kind of career path that I would want, is where you can trace the steps and see that Bob Fujitani always did what he wanted to do. As far as the painting and everything else. I mean, it would have been easy to just be like, okay, well, I'll just draw, like say, like in the late 60s and the late 70s or 60s and 70s, when artists were a lot more uniform. He could have easily just been, filling in for like, I don't know, like Dead Man or whatever. Like not knocking Dead Man, cool. But you get what I'm saying. Like it would have been easier. He would have got more more notoriety and so on and so forth, to step away from things like the newspaper strips and doing paintings and stuff that you want to do, and doing painted covers for the books that you do. And like most people today, if you were like, yeah, this dude was like writing Prince Valiant and Lassie, they'd be like, why? But that's something that he with like the Prince Valiant, he worked on that for a while. Flash Gordon, like that I think that was actually the book that he had the longest run on. And I mean, I dare you to name somebody to find somebody who doesn't have a vague knowledge at the very least of Flash Gordon. My father-in-law, he's rolling up in his later 60s, and he loves Flash Gordon. Like that's still one of the few, when we talk about comic books, that's one of the few characters that still gets brought up. So it's just like, man, like that's how you leave an impact, and you never have to compromise to do anything, and then from all accounts, like it's very rare that somebody has a career in comics that long and there's nothing but nice things said about them. Like when I was researching this, just to, before we decided we were going to hop on and go live, literally just not a single person had anything other to say than fantastic artist, great dude, loved his family, so on and so forth. And it's like, that's the kind of legacy that like an artist should want to leave behind. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of guys that either from that time, maybe they got more, name recognition outside of comics and this, that, and the other. But when you look at the flow of their work, there's 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a bunch of stuff they probably aren't super proud of, and the aftermath as far as like books they did. And I've never met anybody who was like, yeah, I'm totally happy about all those times I pissed off most of the industry, because of me being a jerk, not because like I was standing on, you know, it wasn't like, I don't know, like, because of religious conviction or something, you know, it was because like Frank Miller pisses people off all the time, never for a good reason. I'm just kidding, kind of. I'm just kidding. But
yeah, wrong show for
what I'm saying, though. You know what I mean? It's nuts for anybody in the in any entertainment industry, not just comics, like music or whatever, to have that kind of a testimony where people are just like, that is a beloved person that just contributed a lot to their feelings, you know, and genuinely mean it. And that's just, I mean, if nothing else, that alone is worth tipping our hat to the man.
Yeah, especially now. I mean, that's something I think, like in my research when I was looking into like diving into his life and kind of his interest, what the thing I was drawn to a lot was he's actually a fan, and that's something I can like actually connect to even at an early age. He's born in 21, and in 1921 he says he loved Flash Gordon growing up. So I mean, Flash Gordon doesn't come out until, says it was first published in 34. So he's what, 12 or 13 when Flash Gordon comes out, and he's reading it and he says he never imagined he'd be drawing it. And I mean, that's stuff that, I mean, we're still in that cycle now, you know, and I think it's just, it's kind of, it speaks to the precedent. And that was something I just immediately loved. I was just like, yeah, I mean, we're still doing that. We're still like falling in love with these characters and going into that. And we're seeing people now being like, I can't believe that I'm drawing this. And, you know, this is where it's coming from, is Solar Man of the Atom. He pulls down the lab coat and you see a radioactive symbol on some like crazy red suit with a visor on it. And
it's awesome. It's like that's what it's about, you know, like that's the kind of stuff that just makes comics like just this unique, it's just this whole monster unto itself that's just fantastic. And it's because of things like that, moments like that, where you get to see this dude just suit up with like, you know, like how you, that's not something you can just do. Like you just like, yeah, we're just nuclear power, people are terrified of it, but you know what? We're gonna slap it on his chest and see what happens.
Know, like I mean, it really is. And I mean, I think it does speak to, you know, he was a co-creator of it and did a lot of the visuals for it, and that's kind of the lasting impact. And I know it's arguable that comics are a visual medium, but I really think in the contributions that Fujitani had and the visual contributions and the artwork that he was able to put out in such an extensive career kind of defines that legacy. And that's what will keep us coming back. I mean, it's like 60, maybe 60 years ago when we've had, you know, the early work of Fujitani that we're talking about today still. And, you know, how many years in the future are we still going to be coming back to it and talking about that influence? So, you know, what a career, really.
Yeah, and honestly, I can't think of a better way to put that. Like, that's the kind of, like, that's what it's about. You know, like, if you're a creator, I can't imagine somebody being a writer or an artist, or even if you're, you know, like, into something else, you're a guitarist or a singer or whatever, and hearing and seeing, like, what he was able to accomplish and not being like, that's right there, that's what it's about, you know. When I die, that's the kind of thing that I want people to be able to say about me. Like, I'd be like, he loved Jesus more than anything, and he made dope work with no compromise. You know what I'm saying? And just like make things that just last, not because they were hokey or because they were like these, you know, just like a gimmick or whatever, but just like you said, it was a fan making things for the fans, and that's fantastic.
I mean, is that not what we do here? Like, you know, we're definitely keeping that a bit alive.
I don't know. That's
No, I mean, we're gonna have to dive into some, like, maybe we need to revisit Solar Man of the Atom pretty soon. Get another classic episode going.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I think that sounds like a really good idea.
Yeah, because we did only touch on issue 1. It would be kind of cool to see, you know, what that series did and how it built on, especially those first 5 issues of the 1960s version of solar. I think it would kind of be cool to do a look back at kind of how that evolution happened and maybe one day what the future could look like.
Well, we needed a cliffhanger to go out on, and I think that's about as good as it's gonna get. So keep your eyes peeled, because I would not be shocked to see us dive into that premise for maybe our next video or one after that. I'm not sure yet. We have a lot of stuff in the works for you guys, but as always, keep reading comics, don't pirate comics, stay valiant, and rest in peace, Bob Fujitani, and condolences for the Fujitani family.